Hello, everyone, and welcome to Profiling Evil Podcasts. I'm really looking forward to your comments following this particular broadcast. As you're aware, I looked into the disappearance of the Beaumont children during Season 1 of Mapping Evil with Mike King. Media outlets from across Australia reached out to interview me on the series, and a few of them focused on this crime. As a result, I was really thrilled to have authors Stuart Mullins and Bill Hayes reach out to me to explore the Beaumont case further. It was gratifying to hear them acknowledge my assessment on the case and how they've uncovered evidence that, in fact, supports my theories. There were a couple of bombshells that came out in our discussion that might get lost in all the discussion, so I wanted to clearly restate what happened before we begin. Go back to the morning of the 26th when the children disappeared. As they sat around the kitchen table, Grant and Arnna were teasing Jane. They were repeating the line, "Jane has a boyfriend. Jane has a boyfriend." Well, we mistakenly say that it happened before the day they disappeared, but that's not the case. It happened on the day that the children went to and disappeared from the Collie Reserve. Again, this is really important because the kids are teasing Jane that morning, something behaviorally that indicates that they were going to meet or planned on seeing a man who had been paying some attention to this child or some other boy. Now, it's also important to note that the children were given enough money to take the bus and buy lunch for all three of them, nothing else. You're going to hear how evidence was uncovered in this case that the children actually had more money than what they were sent with by their mother and completely different denominations. In fact, when they entered Wenzel's Bakery, they purchased food for 6 people, and presumably one of those lunches was for their attacker. So as you listen, you're going to hear Stuart and Bill lay down this circumstantial evidence case. It points strongly toward their suspect. The evidence is so compelling, and this story will have you searching for more info online while you impatiently wait for their new book titled Unmasking the Killer of the Missing Beaumont Children. Now let's get started with the case discussion. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Profiling Evil Podcasts. I'm Mike King, and I'm going to be exploring an unsolved crime from down under. That's right. This crime is so heart-wrenching that it shook the people of Australia to the very core, robbing them of their innocence and changing that country forever. I'm joined by the authors of a new book that's coming out on the abduction and murder of the Beaumont children. Let me introduce Stuart Mullins and Bill Hayes. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, gosh, this is my privilege to have you on, and I am so excited about unmasking, and I'm going to have you talk a little more about that, but your backgrounds are entirely different. Your collaboration on this case created, I think, a bond that will probably never be broken. Stuart, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I was born in Glenelg in the late 1950s, where the Beaumont children also lived. I only lived up the road from them, and also my grandmother lived in the same suburbs. So I grew up in those suburbs that the Beaumont children grew up with, and then I moved, went to Richmond, New South Wales, did my high school there. I became a qualified teacher. And during that time, I met a good friend of mine, Alan Whitaker, who was an author. And because I was very au fait with the case and growing up in the streets of Glenelg, Alan was asked to write the first definitive account of the disappearance of the Beaumont children. And of course, he called me and he said, look, you grew up around those suburbs and you knew their sort of lifestyle. And you were the same age as Arnna Beaumont, who at the time I think was 7, 8 years old. And so was I. And I only went to the school just up from them, only about 3, 4 Ks up. I knew their school, Paringa Park Primary School, and I played into school sport with them. I knew their lifestyle. I knew mine. So when Alan said, can you help us in this first definitive account? I don't know, Adelaide, you do. I mean, I didn't need Google Maps. I just just knew where we were going. I knew where the Beaumont children lived. I knew Collie Reserve, where they were abducted from, because I went down there as a kid with my parents. So I was very au fait with it. And as the story unfolded, and I know I'm going a bit forward here, but there's one remaining detective that was at the Glenelg police station that fateful day in January 1966, January 26, 1966, and that's Mostyn Matters. He is, in fact, my cousin.
Well, this is amazing to me because when you think about it, you understand that it was okay for kids to jump on a bus and go somewhere together and go alone without their mom and dad. This is really great, and I want to get exploring into this a little further. But Bill, you and I shared a profession in law enforcement. You went on to do private investigations, and then you and Stuart decided to tackle this case. Why don't you cover a little bit of your background and how the two of you decided to link up and look at this case?
Well, I'm a migrant to Australia. I was actually born in Northern Ireland. Spent a lot of my childhood moving around in England, and then eventually joined the British Forces, where I trained as an engineer to especially do demolitions. I then went on and did airborne training and became a paratrooper. When I left the United Kingdom, I wanted to migrate to Australia with my family, and I came to South Australia, and I'm going to age myself here, it was around the time of the Vietnam War. My intention was to join the Australian Army and go to Vietnam to gain the benefits that I'd get as a veteran who'd served in Vietnam. Being a new migrant, that would help. Anyhow, the good old USA decided to stop the war, so that didn't happen. The war finished and I couldn't join up. So someone suggested I join the police. Now, I had two generations of police in my family prior to me. I thought in the end it wasn't a bad idea. I joined and became a police officer. And during my time as a police officer, when I was a uniform officer, I had worked with a young man who was my junior partner, if you like, and he was a cousin of the Beaumont children. And he spoke to me about the story, which I wasn't overly familiar with at the time. But it became personal, with Mark, because he was such a good boy, and it was obviously a touching thing for him. So I always kept and maintained the interest of that. I became a detective, and at one stage when I was based on the Major Crime Squad, who does the homicide investigations in the state, I was put into a spare room when I had a bit of time to read some cold cases to get a fresh view from the department's point of view of these cases. The one I got was the Beaumont children, which, as you'd imagine, is a very large room full of very large boxes packed to the gunwales with information. I did some reading and learned some more about it. Then time passed as I left the police department. I was headhunted out by an organisation and worked as an investigator in the private field, which I've done and maintain to this day. In relation to Stuart, he contacted me because I think it's fair to say that the investigation was becoming quite difficult for a layperson. The expectations of doing it and doing it correctly were high, and Stuart realised his inadequacies, if I could say that, Stuart, in that area, and that he needed some professional help. Kind of long story short, I was recommended to him by some people, and he contacted me. When he contacted me, I listened. I asked to read the book Searching for the Beaumonts that had initiated all this information, which I'm no doubt you will probably touch on. And I did that. And when I did it, I was interested, but I was determined that I wasn't going to become obsessed with this crime, as some investigators had in the past, to their detriment. And I think to the detriment of the investigation, it became too close to it. But that I would also seek to disprove everything that Stuart had found to that point, because that was the level of proof it was going to face in the public arena. Stuart agreed to that and was very happy for me to have that attitude, and away we went. That's now 13 years ago. So we've been at it ever since.
What a great friendship. Well, let's jump into this. Let's go back to 1966. Jane, Arnna, and Grant Beaumont, collectively known as the Beaumont children, disappeared from a beach area near Adelaide, South Australia on January 26th, 1966. Now, this is a very special day in Australia known as Australia Day, and I'm going to show off a little bit and flaunt my historical knowledge of your country, having worked down there for so many times. Australia Day marks the 1788 landing of the first fleet at Sydney Cove, and I always find it interesting that these strange and horrible crimes seem to happen on holidays. And as a profiler, I've wondered if it has something to do with how we can drop our guard a little bit. We just think people are going to be like us and that they have good thoughts. Little do we know that there are predators out there who are looking for targets in specific times. But I want to start with a question for both of you. Let's go back. And now you've mentioned, Stuart, that you grew up in the area. Bill, that you looked at the case as a cold case investigator and had a cousin there. But what was it that really caused you to investigate and write about the Beaumont children?
Well, firstly, we go to Alan because he was asked by his publishers, John Wiley and Son, can he write the first definitive account? And it is that crime that shocked Australia. So he jumped at it because no book had ever been written about this case. And I helped him, of course. And then when you write a book, and you guys would know this, you write a book about true crime, people are going to read it. And, of course, you'll get phone calls. And that's where now 99% usually are sort of theories. Bill, you've both heard these, the theories, I think they did it, hearsay. But there was one in particular. Her name was Angela Phipps, or Angela Fife. She changed her name, but Angela Phipps. Now, when she called Alan called me, and there was a few things she said that really stood out and actually sent chills down my spine. And I think with Bill, not even think with Bill, when I met Bill, I did mention this particular piece of information. She said that her former father-in-law, Harry Phipps, she believed may have something to do with it, with this abduction, because she gleaned in the book that the description of the man, and this man was known to give out pound notes, or Jane Beaumont was given a pound note by this man to buy lunch because their money was taken, and we can get into that later and why it was taken. And she was last seen at Wenzel's Bakery in Glenelg buying lunch with a pound note that her mother did not give her. And I know with Bill, this raised his eyebrows as much as it did with me and Alan Whittaker, because a pound note in 1966 was a huge amount of money for a child to have. I knew that. I saw it inside my mum's purse, and every now and then I thought, gee, that'd be nice to take a pound note, and that could buy me buckets and buckets of lollies. But where are you going to hide them? So that thinking went out the window. But it was a lot of money. Now, she said, I know that my former father-in-law gave out pound notes. He tipped in pound notes. He was a very wealthy businessman, and he owned a factory called Castelloy just down the road that was very, very profitable. He was a millionaire in 1966. His description fit, and this is what got Bill too. He fitted the description, handed out pound notes, and he lived 190 metres in direct sight of Collie Reserve, where the children were last seen. And he lived 200 metres down at right angles to Wenzel's Bakery in Glenelg. I mean, as Alan Whittaker said many years ago, this is like a Bermuda Triangle. Now, there was one more thing. She said, I think that my former husband, Hayden Phipps, was sexually abused by Harry for many years, and I do know that he had a deviant satin fetish, that when he loved dressing in women's clothing. That doesn't make you a pedophile, by the way, but when it encroaches on a child's personal space, it does, and it did, she believed, with Hayden. So you've got 190 metres from Collie Reserve, you've got the pound note, you've got the physical description, and you've got the sexual abuse. And I know with Bill that raised his eyebrows too.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to that as we talk about the suspectology and who we start really looking at in this crime. But Bill, could you outline what happened on that day, the things that the children were doing, the thing that changed their risk level and put them in a position that they could be abducted and then later victimized? Let's kind of paint a picture of what happened.
As a preamble to what I'm about to say, I should mention that Arnna, the second child, had said to the mother, I think the day before, they'd been down the beach, which was a place that they went to a lot during the holidays, and had said to the mother that Jane has a boyfriend. It wasn't taken any further than that by Mrs. Beaumont, but it certainly may mean something now in the cold light of day, given what's happened. On the day in question, it was a very hot day. It was about 38 to 39 degrees centigrade, which in the old scale, it's a Fahrenheit scale for those in the US, is probably around the 100 and 105 degree mark. And it was greater than 90% humidity. So it was a hot, sticky day, or a period of days. And as was the case back then in the holidays and weekends during the summer, people would flock to the beach. Glenelg at that time was, and still is, probably our most popular beach to go to. So on that period, during that period, the children were on holidays and had gone down to the beach prior to the 26th of January, Australia Day, and did again on the 26th of January go down. Prior to going, their mother had prepared them about what bus they were to get to come home from the beach, the bus fares, and a small amount of money for lunch, amounting to, in the old scale, about 2 and 6 and 3 shillings, something like that. It wasn't much. It was enough to do what they had to do. So off the children went. This was nothing unusual for the kids, and it wasn't unusual for any child in Australia in 1966, particularly Adelaide. Adelaide is a nice city which has a big country town feel about it. Children were safe. You could leave your front door unlocked and go to bed. You'd have no problems. You could leave your car unlocked with the keys in it. No one would steal it. It was quite a laid-back sort of a place, and children were very, very safe to that point. So it wasn't unusual for any children to go on their own to the beach. Down they went to Glenelg Beach that day, and the story then is took up by witnesses because they were seen to come down, and they went directly to a man who was lying on the grass before they got there, near the beach. It was a grassy area. They went to him and spoke to him, put their own towels on the grass, and started playing with the man, little games, etc. That was seen by some witnesses. It was nothing unusual. I think the majority of people who saw it thought he must be an uncle or a father or a friend, something like that. So the children were playing, and there was thousands of people down at the beach on that day. I'd have to mention thousands. So they were playing with this man off and on, playing in the sprinklers, chasing around with each other. During the process of that happening, the man, the clothing was sitting on a bench, folded up, and the man had asked people nearby, had they seen anyone go near the clothing because the children had lost their money. Now, the money that he's talking about was the bus fare and lunch money that Mrs. Beaumont had given the children, which was contained in a small purse that Jane used frequently. No one had seen anything because no one had been near the clothing, we believe. We believe that was the setup. That was the control point where he would get control of the children by saying, okay, you've lost your bus fare home, you've lost your lunch money, I can get you home, I'll help you, I'll do that. And bearing in mind, he was a kind, friendly man at that stage. Yeah.
This is so interesting when we think about the grooming tactics that predators put into play and the amount of time that was invested for him to get these children to the point that they would just come up and sit down near him, and for it to be so natural at that point that people around wouldn't think oddly of that. Stuart, the primary suspect that you focused on lived close to the area. I mean, weren't there concerns about this individual and his fetishes, his focus on different kinds of things, and that all of a sudden he's hanging out at the beach a lot?
This is 1966, and if you have a look at the predator pedophiles that only came to justice in the 1990s, not even that, early 2000s, and you see that, I think that NASA, the gymnast, the Olympic gymnast, I mean, he was sexually abusing those girls for decades And he's only just reached prison because you don't look at these types of people. He was an upstanding businessman. Who would have looked at him in 1966? Members of the clergy. Now, it was only, recently, or fairly recently, in the last decade or so, that we start to see justice being done there. But this was going on way back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, sexual abuse. We weren't looking at a Harry Phipps. We weren't looking at people in positions of power, in influence, because they weren't capable of such a heinous crime. In 1966, we were looking for the dirty old man. And that was a terminology that my parents used, most probably with you guys too. Watch out for the dirty old man. And they used to chuckle. But really what they were saying, if it was in today's terms, is watch out for the pedophile. But we didn't think much of it. But they were right in front of you. But we didn't know, because that wasn't the parents at that time in 1966. It wasn't what we thought a pedophile was. In fact, that word wasn't even used.
In plain sight is a term you yourself have used in some of your writings, Mike, and that's exactly what Harry Phipps was doing.
Well, and you think about this, I mean, it is so disturbing that we, number one, allow certain kinds of behaviors to go on. And today, hopefully, we're getting better at requiring things. But I want to go back to you, Bill, to tell the rest of the story. And I want to use something you said as kind of a segue back, and that was that Jane has a boyfriend. And again, this grooming tactic that was going on is so clear when we look at this in hindsight. But why don't you carry on the story now?
So the children were last seen moving towards an area where they could get dressed after they'd finished playing. This was now late morning, coming up towards noon. And that was really the last, up to a point, that was the last time they were seen prior to arriving at Wenzel's Bakery, which is a nearby bakery, with a £1 note to buy cakes for themselves for lunch and a pie for the man, which is the term used by Jane to the lady in the shop. So after that, there was no sign, no evidence that the children were anywhere. They were never seen again after Wenzel's Bakery, to the best of our knowledge. Never seen again. And this is where the story then changes, goes forward decades to when Alan Whittaker writes the book Searching for the Beaumonts, which caused this phone call that Stuart had spoken about from a lady called Angela Fife, who was married to Hayden Phipps, the son of Harry Phipps. And she gave a story of Hayden nightmaring whilst they were married, face down in bed, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like he was engaging in a sexual act or being engaged in a sexual act. It was a nightmare situation for him. She woke him up and eventually got to speak to him about why this was happening. And he let her know that he'd been sexually abused by his father, Harry Phipps, since the age of about 4 years old. That abuse had stopped when Hayden reached 14 years old and became a big boy, and had threatened his father with assault because his father at that stage had actually assaulted Hayden's mother. When that happened, the father disappeared for 2 or 3 days from the house and then came back, and the sexual assaults finished. They stopped. Hayden had become too big, too old, and wasn't complicit in what was happening. So when we got that information, she read Angela read the Searching for the Beaumonts and was prompted to call the author, Alan Whittaker, and gave the information that led us then into this investigation and led us to finding Hayden, who at that stage, he and Angela had divorced, but was living in a man's shelter in Queensland. I went up to that place and found him. I was quite surprised at the person I found. I didn't expect him to be the way he was. We'd heard things from people that he was mentally ill, he was disturbed, he was an alcoholic, he was a drug addict. We heard all this stuff. But what I found was a very quiet, intelligent, decent man, quite intellectual, well-spoken. And he was willing to sit down with me, which we sat down together for a number of hours. and I recorded an interview with him about his experience. He shocked me in as much as he told me, now bearing in mind my knowledge of the case as it wasn't in-depth great knowledge, but I knew they hadn't been seen after leaving the beach, apart from Winsel's, up to that point. But he told me that he had seen the children coming into the backyard of their home. He was in what is known over here as a cubby, like a little treehouse type thing, having a sly smoke. He was 14 years old, 15 years old, having a sly smoke, and his father was loading his Pontiac Parisienne with bags, surfboard bags, which Hayden believed contained his satin clothing, which he used to make quite often at home. And he told me that he would be doing that to take the satin clothing to his cottage, which he kept at Castleroy, a large factory, 5 kilometres from the beach. And he would keep his satin clothing there. But that was his fetish. He would do anything to protect his fetish. And it was safe in that cottage because no one but Harry could get into the cottage. So he's loading the bags with these, containing these satin clothes, we believe. That's really important in the scenario of what we're looking at with the children, because we know that when Harry watched, seen, wore, handled anything to do with satin, he would become uncontrollable in a sexual way, to the point where he was known to spontaneously ejaculate because of the feel of the satin clothing on his body. So he's handling this satin clothing, and into that scene walks 3 little children, when Harry would have been beyond all reason in relation to his arousal. Hayden has seen them walk in, speak to the father, and they went inside the house. They were there for a short time. Then Harry came back out, continued to load stuff into the car, and then drove off. I believe at that period, the children had left the house and gone to Wenzel's with a £1 note, which I believe was given to them by Harry, who a £1 note for Harry Phipps was like his business card. Here am I, a wealthy man, I can afford to give out £1 notes. We have a number of statements from older men now, but who were young men at the time, who were played with Hayden as children. And they loved doing that because if Harry wanted them to leave, he would give them all a £1 note, a £1 note, and tell them to go. In not such a pleasant way, but he'd tell them to go. And they loved hanging around with Hayden because they'd never seen £1 notes. So that was his calling card. There's a lot of money. That was his calling card. So they arrived with the £1 note. So Hayden had gone into the house once Harry drove off, found the house empty and the front door left ajar, open, and no signs of any disturbance, no signs of children. Obviously, at that time, the children had come in, got the money, presumably gone down to Wenzel's to buy the pies and cakes, and been picked up from there, never to be seen again.
Folks, I'm talking to Stuart Mullins and Bill Hayes, authors of a new book on the abduction and disappearance of the Beaumont children, a case that rocked the nation of Australia. It took away a sense of security that country had forever. Stuart, I found it so interesting when we came together. We had you reached out to me because of an interview that I'd done in Australia. Why don't you talk about some of those comparative things and why we got together?
Well, actually, Bill called me. He'd listened to it, and then I'd been working. Well, I knew the people at 5AA, the radio station that you were on. I'd done an interview in their studios regarding the Beaumont children. But Bill called me and said, "Oh, you might want to listen to this." So I did listen to it on their website. And then I called the producer, who I knew quite well, and got your contacts, because what you were saying was more about the profiling, that these sort of crimes have the same modus operandi worldwide. And they do. They operate in the same way. And something you said, that they operate within their, what you call a comfort zone. They don't travel too far. They don't come from interstate or in the United States, they don't travel thousands of miles to abduct a child and then disappear again. They usually know the lay of the land. And that really got me. I thought you are right on the money. And it's, as far as myself and Bill and many others now, that this individual highly likely lived within a close proximity of Collie Reserve, and of course Harry Phipps did. And that really struck a chord with me. So of course I was on the contacting you straight away, because you were right on the money as far as we were concerned, and I discussed this with Bill.
We talked a lot about, when we first met, about why write the Satin Man. We talked about geographic profiling and the work that you'd done. I mean, Satin Man's reaching back 70 years, but let's talk a little bit about that. Why is all that so important?
Satin Man, when I did a reasonable amount of investigation, and then I asked for Bill's help. The other reason I asked for Bill's help is because I'd had enough with South Australian major crime. Some detectives, I just had enough. In fact, one detective, and I'll quote this because that's what he said. He said, Stuart, at the end, he wasn't, in my opinion, wasn't doing a thorough job. And he said some things to me, and I've got this in an email, funnily enough, that he sent to me. He said he did a certain thing, and he did not, because I found him out. At that time, I mentioned that to him, and he told me in no uncertain terms I was beating my head up against a brick wall and chasing my tail. And coming from a professional, I wouldn't take too kindly to that anyway. I asked, who's the best private investigator in South Australia? And this gentleman's name, Bill Hayes, came up time and time again, because the information, the circumstantial evidence that was stacking up against Harry Phipps was gobsmacking. I mean, and that's what the Satin Man follows, that circumstantial evidence through. And Bill took it even further with that. There is over 10 pieces of circumstantial evidence linking Harry Phipps to the disappearance of the Beaumont children. That's corroborated. Now, usually, and I've asked detectives, and Bill, I think it would back me up on this, that once you start getting over 3 pieces of circumstantial evidence, you really starts raising your eyebrows regarding that individual. And Harry, it's 10. And I've already mentioned some of those. And of course, the sexual abuse. But he was a serial sexual abuse. It was serial on that one. And also with my investigation, I remembered asking 2 very senior managers, former senior managers at Castelloy that were there in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And I spoke to them about that. They weren't surprised when I talked about the sexual abuse and Harry Phipps. They knew or heard rumours about his satin fetish. But they said if Hayden Phipps was sexually abused, it wouldn't surprise them, because he hated his father, and because he worked at the factory for a time, Hayden. He hated his father with a passion, and they couldn't put it down to any workplace issue. Both of them said something was going on at home, but we're not quite sure why. And of course, that sounded alarm bells. So all that circumstantial evidence was building in the Satin Man book when it came out. It was actually a bestseller. And I'm not surprised, not because myself and Bill were involved, because it really highlights this case can be solved. It can be solved. And the individual was staring us right in the face. But the circumstantial evidence in the Satin Man book, that's what it does. It step by step, the circumstantial evidence, and it builds to a crescendo.
I think it's so interesting, Bill, with the hindsight of 55 years now, what are some of the clues that the law enforcement folks just blatantly missed, in your opinion? And again, a benefit of 55 years now, and we have more answers. And then talk a little bit, Stuart, Bill, about the makeshift graves that were built or dug behind the factory, because that really troubled me when I reviewed this case on Mapping Evil with Mike King.
You must realise that policing back in 1966, certainly in South Australia, isn't the science-based policing that we now apply. It was the old gumtree type policing where the officer would get out and knock doors and speak to people. And that particular case, the Beaumonts, is very, very difficult because there really wasn't a crime scene per se. Not somewhere they can go and put forensics down to check things. There was nothing really at that stage that they could look at. They simply had to cast the net as wide as their resources would allow them to and see what come out of it. I think at the time they did what they could. I know that they were under-resourced. Most of the work was done by the local team of detectives at Glenelg, and there's only, I think, 4 of them from memory, and they had to take the majority of the work. They had some assistance from the city, because Glenelg is an outer suburb of the city. They had some assistance, but not anything like they would have required. So they're under the pump manpower-wise, and Mostyn would tell us that they were working 16 hours a day, day after day after day after week after week to try and get everything done. It was a pretty cold trail. There was nowhere to go to pick up on something. The reserve had been trampled over by thousands of feet by the time the police actually became aware of where all this had started, and that there hadn't been any witnesses that we knew of that had seen the children after them leaving the beach. So it was a difficult crime for the police to investigate at that time. They were hoping, I think, as you always do as a police officer, for some public input, some response from the public. The difficulty arose with that where the media was putting out information that was incorrect. So the public, who are our best observers of all these things, were looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for a young, blonde-headed, surfy type of person, which Harry was not. So those furfies, if we can call them that, set people off in the wrong angle. The police didn't get the help that they might have expected because people were looking in the wrong place at the wrong things, thanks to poor reporting and media.
Just with that, Bill, you're right. The original description on the Thursday or the Friday was the media obviously want to sell newspapers, so it was straight to the media. It hadn't been corroborated. He had a blonde-haired, mop top of blonde hair in need of cutting. But by the Monday, when the police had actually corroborated, that was in the paper, but it was only a small section down in the left hand of the second page. It was only small. It'd been changed. The police said the man had light brown, fairish to light brown brush back hair and parted to one side, longish face, sharp features, athletic build. So it was light brown hair, brushed back, parted to one side. However, you don't let the truth get in the way of a great story. So everybody wanted it to be mop top, a blonde, the dirty old man. Oh, here we go. They weren't looking for, so therefore Harry, and we believe it is, got off scot-free. We weren't looking at him. The general public was still looking for years. And I've seen podcasts and they've done a great job. But when it comes to the description of the man, they use the blonde-haired surfy type description. Still now. Never was. Never was.
And we often lean on the public information that's put out by the media because it's the most credible source, we believe. Well, tell me, Stuart, about those graves, because I talked to you before about that. That troubled me when I saw it. It troubled me as I learned more about it.
I received a call, or Alan received a call from David and Robin Harkin a few years back, and because this story was now starting to reach the media. Channel 9, A Current Affair in Australia, is very popular. And at the time, Today Tonight with Frank Pangello, which was absolutely brilliant. They're no longer. Frank's now in politics and a great friend of ours. But that hit the press, and Harry's Phipps's name came out, and it was news for everybody. You could see it on, you could Google Harry Phipps's name and he was right out there. That 2 men, they were boys in 1966, remembered digging a grave-size hole, that's their words, not myself and Bill's, at the back of the cast alloy factory. They called Alan called me, I called Bill. I did meet 2 of the boys, but so did Bill. But their story was very credible. But the dimensions, I always remember the dimensions when they said grave-size hole. It was 3 foot wide, 5 or 6 foot long, or 6 foot deep, and it had to have straight sides. That was really interesting. It had to have straight sides. And they said it was Harry Phipps because he was there in their Pontiac Paris scene, just sitting in his car, not too far away, and he said they would just stare at them, just sit there and not say much, didn't say anything. He'd come out, he'd walk, he'd look into the grave-size hole, wasn't good enough, so they kept digging, and this was in 100 degrees heat. And over 2 days, they dug and they dug, but they did get paid in pound notes. So we've got Jane that gets a pound note. So it's like follow the money. 3 days later or 4 days later, they get paid in pound notes. And that was bloody hard work. And then he told him, as Bill said, he has a particular word that's very unsavoury. He gave him pound notes and told them to F off, don't come back. But we don't know who filled in the hole. But also Bill, I'll leave it to Bill on this one because he had met also both and interviewed them.
Okay, if I could take a step back too, with the police investigation before we go back to the holes. What the police did do was a hand-drawn photo fit of the man seen with the children at the Collie Reserve that day. That became really important later because we were able to morph that photo fit together with a photograph that we had of Harry taken at about the time the children were missing. And it was a perfect match, unbelievably good match. But anyway, it's all in the book. Going back to the holes, I did speak to David initially and then his brother Robin. I found two well-educated men, one having been an engineer, university qualified engineer, the other very high-ranking public servant in the education department, the school system. So there were two credible men in that regard, and they told this interesting story of digging this hole this day and of the man. The interest in the Pontiac Parisienne is big because back in 1966, there wouldn't have been more than one or two, if that, Pontiac Parisiennes in South Australia. So it wasn't a car you see every day, and that's stuck in the mind because a lot of silver, a lot of chrome, a lot of big wings, and the typical car of its day in the United States. And Harry had imported it in because he could afford to. So the car stuck out in their mind very distinctly. The hole was dug, and they couldn't see any rationale or reason for the hole because there was nothing lying there to put into the hole, like if you're going to dump rubbish to get rid of it. There was nothing there, so they had to just dig the hole and leave the hole, which would have meant that this man who'd watched them, Harry, would have had to fill the hole in himself, presumably, when he put in whatever it was he was going to put into it. The day was extremely hot, as I said before. It was in the high 30s during those days. If the children had met foul play, which we believe they would have by then, he had to have somewhere to put the bodies. I don't think that killing them was planned. I think that abusing them was planned, and it's my belief that the young boy, unfortunately Grant, may have been the primary target, but Jane would never have stood for anything like that. I think the reaction they would have got from Jane would have ended in him doing what we believe he did, and that was disposing of the three children. He had too much to lose for it to be found out. So he had to do something with the bodies because they would have been decaying. And this was, I believe, a keeper hole, somewhere to keep him in the shorter term till he could work out a better place to put them. So the hole was dug and presumably filled in sometime later by someone. Fast forward many, many years, and we are looking now to find the hole. We had one false start, which we got over, but we found the correct place, and we had a geophysical survey done of the area where we believe the hole was dug, and we found the hole as it was back then in 1966, with about a metre of topsoil covering it when we did the survey. But we also found a second hole that was been dug down to the same depth and in the same dimensions and shape as the original hole, but in an L shape, if you like, form an L shape with the original hole. So we were very curious about what might have been in there. What we did find was that the profile showed some anomalies about halfway down in the original first hole. When the police started digging the hole in 2018, they dug out what was the second hole first, there was nothing in there, not even a screw, not a piece of wood, not an animal bone, nothing, which is quite bizarre. Why would you dig a hole that size and not put anything in? The second hole, the original hole, was dug down, and halfway down we found some animal bones. But it wasn't like the carcass of a dog or cat or anything. It was a bone from here and a bone from there of different animals, just put in there haphazardly, not burying a carcass of an animal. And then further down, they dug to the depth, and there was nothing there at all. So this big hole was presumably dug to that depth, then half filled in, animal carcasses pieces put in, then refilled to the top and left. Does not make sense. Totally irrational. I believe that was a bit of a blind. Harry, being the cautious man he is, if he had been found out to have dug this hole so proximate to the time the children were missing, and the police went to dig at the hole, they would have dug halfway down, found the animal bones, said, "Oh, well, that's what it is. He said it was animal bones, and here they are. Everything's fine. Let's go." And the children would have been maybe deeper down.
Yeah, I mean, what a brilliant
Why
move
the
in
second
reality. You think about it, it's a brilliant move to have witnesses that can testify, we dug the hole, he was abusive, he sent us off, he gave us a pound note. And what a great diversionary tactic, if in fact he really thought
Yeah.
that far ahead.
I believe he would. He was when you know Harry, and we do know him now. I believe I've been inside his head for a while now, and Stuart has too. We know a lot about him and his behaviour, which, as we discussed before, is a pattern that we see with people of this nature all the time. However, Harry was extremely intelligent. He was a brilliant engineer. He was very innovative, and he invented things that had never been invented before. His father was a scientist and an inventor, and Harry had inherited that. So we're talking about quite a brilliant, rational man. He only became irrational when he started to get sexually aroused with the Saturn. So he would have thought this through, and he would have been looking for something to direct the police away from him if it came to that. This was a perfect thing to do. And knowing the police, he knew that if they dug halfway down and found animal bones, and he told them there's only animal bones in there, they would have left it at that and gone. So the second hole, we can only speculate about. But what appeared to me, and as I thought about it afterwards and trying to get inside Harry's head, was that when someone falls down a sinkhole, for example, they don't dig out the sinkhole to retrieve the person. They dig down parallel to the sinkhole, then go in from the side and take the person out into the new hole and take them back to the surface. Could this new hole have been dug to remove whatever was in the bottom of the first hole? I believe that if they were in there, the bodies would have been in the surfboard bags that Harry manufactured at that time, and it would have been easier for anyone retrieving to go in and pull bags out into the new hole. Might also add that I did speak to an 85-year-old gentleman who had worked there, who could recall seeing 4 men under supervision of another man digging a hole somewhere around that area some years after the event. On testing this man's memory, I came to the conclusion that his memory was not great because he was inconsistent in some of the things he would tell me at the start of the story, the middle of the story, and the end of the story, which meant he wasn't a good witness. I did believe that he had seen something, the men and digging. Where it was happening and when it was happening was a bit fluid, I think. But it's interesting that he did, and then we find this secondary hole sometime later.
I think it's one of those cases, as Bill would attest to, it shocked Australia. It shocked us to our core, as you said. And there's always been who was involved or the abduction of the Beaumont children. We want this answered. It's not people say, I've had this. Bill's had this. I'll leave it be. Let the parents. They've had enough grief. It's the people that are living. Mrs. Beaumont, Nancy Beaumont's passed away, but we, as the people of South Australia that were born there, we still want answers. It's us. at heart that constantly lives with this question: who was involved? Can it be solved? I mean, it's been grating with us for 5 decades. It's a topic that everybody talks about. We would like to see it solved. We believe we can solve it, and it would bring closure, not just for the parents, but for the South Australian public. Closure. We now know what happened, and we believe, as Bill, as myself do, and many others now, that Harry Phipps is definitely the culprit. And that's why we've been determined to keep going and keep pushing. I've been told, give it up, give it up. Why you keep doing this? Because we believe he is the person. And we'll continue until we see that justice has been done, that we do get a quality investigation from the South Australian Police. So by pushing this, it's going to raise interest again and maybe focus on the lack, in my opinion, I think Bill's too, of the lack of investigation into Harry Phipps.
Well, you are absolutely correct that it still needs to be solved, that the family, whether living or dead, deserve to have their case followed up. And law enforcement sadly gets so consumed with all of the current day stuff that they forget that there are still victims that they need to advocate for, and these are victims that need to be advocated for. I salute you. I want to encourage anyone who's out there to go to the Mapping Evil website and look at the Beaumont children story map that we created that walks through some of this. And with your permission, I'd like to work with you to, when the time comes that unmasking is delivered, that we update that story map so that it drives people back to the book and drives people to more appropriate content about Phipps, because you've convinced me that he is certainly worth talking about further. And Bill, I know you have a comment, and with that comment, would you please just talk about the title of the book, when it will be released, and how people can get it as we bring this to a close?
Thank you, Mike. Look, yes, my closing comment in relation to your question why is I've had a strong sense of there being injustice in relation to this investigation, in as much as it hasn't been followed as judiciously as it should have been, that these children need someone to champion their cause. This is repulsive in the extreme, what happened to these children. And we, Stuart and I, believe that it's something that we must do, not something we want to do, but it's something that we must do and will continue to do. And we won't be deterred by anyone from following the leads that we find. In relation to the book, we've called it Unmasking the Killer of the Missing Beaumont Children. We're currently in negotiation with publishers. We hope to know more about that very, very soon. When the book is published, we do hope that it's published not only in Australia, but through the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe. It is a case that's unique in the world of its nature. It's unique, and it's a story worth reading, and a story for us, it's a story worth telling. And we'll be happy to work with you, Mike. It's been a great experience, and reading your mapping information prior to these interviews, I'm very, very interested in what you've done.
Stuart, what would you add?
I said it very well. The book that will be coming out, we are talking to publishers right now, Unmasking the Killer of the Missing Beaumont Children. I mean, we followed this through, follow Harry Phipps by the end of it, and I know myself and Bill wrote it, but we were pretty chuffed with it, because by the end of that book, or not even by the end, you're saying to yourself, Harry Phipps, highly likely, he must be the killer, but we'll say highly likely the killer of Jane, Arnna and Grant Beaumont. I mean, the circumstantial evidence that's corroborated in this book, it goes on from what the Saturn Man says, and we name names, and also we've got we've got 3 chapters in there. There was Hayden Phipps that was sexually abused. There is another lady that's come out called Linda that Bill's interviewed, that allegedly Harry Phipps has abused. She's been filmed, and she's very credible. It did happen as far as we're concerned. And also recently, another individual that's come forward that basically their story is they were sexually abused as a child inside those Castelloy cottages, and Bill's following that one up. That is in the book. So now you've got a serial predator pedophile living 190 metres from College Reserve, and that's what the book explores. Not just that, but the geographic profiling, the characteristics of the sexually abused, and also the characteristics of a predator pedophile. And there's more with that.
6 years later, 2 more children were abducted from the Adelaide Oval, which is about 11 kilometres from Glenelg. And we've mentioned it as a chapter in the book about that. And we've done some comparisons to the person who was seen with those 2 children when they're being taken from the Adelaide Oval during a sporting event, and matched them with Harry. And you'd have to say, even the most sceptical person would say there are similarities.
My thanks to Stuart Mullins and Bill Hayes, authors of Unmasking the Killer of the Beaumont Children. Watch for it to come out soon. And I will predict that you will have undoubtedly many more people who will step forward once that book comes out and come to your attention as additional victims. This is compelling. I am so appreciative that you would take time. I'm so honored that together we can continue to push for the Beaumont children and the Beaumont family, that they might get the justice that they had, and appeal with you to law enforcement to not give up in bringing this case to closure. I want to thank everybody who supports Profiling Evil. You can go to your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And to Bill and Stuart, thank you again for joining today. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.